2023 from Washington University in St. Louis on a Fulbright scholarship, and has recently completed an MFA in nonfiction writing from the University of Iowa. His first book of poems, The Highest Hiding Place, was given the Madrigal Gonzalez Best First Book Award. His work has received the Academy of American Poets Prize, the Philippines Free Press Awards, and the Don Carlos Palanca Memorial Awards, among others. Without further ado, I give the stage to Mr. Marne Kilates.
Hello. Yan. It works. Sabi ni Larry kanina mukhang kami lang ang tungkol sa tula, no? Although there were some poems read in the other sessions, but our subject right now is really about poetry, but a unique, a special kind of poetry, which is based mainly on image, no? For me, the example I'm going to give you later after I read what I've written dito is it just happens to be sourced from the archives, no? So that's probably my main connection with the historical material, but this type of poetry, which also more often proceeds from images, which are more often sourced from, apart from, of course, from the contemporary art scene, is also sourced from history. Anyway, I permit me to read to you what I've written, not exactly for this session. It's called anyway, I'll just explain later, no? The air inside the frame, which is what I'm calling this kind of practice, is the title for my anticipated collection of picture poems, or more properly called ekphrasis, or singular ekphrasis, adjective ekphrastic, which is a description of a work of art as a rhetorical exercise as defined by Frederick Armas. The Greeks used to use the word from ek and phrasis, out and speak, respectively, to mean to call out or proclaim an inanimate object by name, perhaps like the first man or woman naming things. Today, the word is used more technically as the term for a poem that vividly or dramatically describes verbally a visual work of art, real or imagined, or more simply, a poem based on or inspired by a work of art, which can be a painting, sculpture, or even music, dance, a scene from a play, and more recently, a photograph. My planned collection gathers 65 ekphrastic poems, more or less, from 8 books of poems I have written over the last more or less 4 decades, plus a few new ones, and sampled in this in the book I'm planning to do. This covers more or less the entire period I have engaged my muse since I left my native city of Legazpi in 1977 to work in Manila up to now. Surely I didn't know the Greek term then. When much later I came across the word, I tended to avoid using it as I felt it was a bit too academic or even pretentious for my purposes. though I can't think of many reasons to object to what is academic, but pretentious, surely. It was mainly because I didn't want to turn away readers who were or are so few to start with. On the other hand, my interest and inclination towards the visual arts have never diminished since I started making drawings in childhood, and later creating my own comic books with a friend who was also a would-be poet, and then graduating into colored pencils and watercolor. At the same time, I looked up to the eldest brother who painted and later worked as an illustrator for one of the comic book publications in Manila. In all cultures, we are told the instinct and skill to draw develops in a child early, while writing needs to be taught, usually in school. What is to be expected, since writing is a more complicated use of language, and for a child, another stage or method of acquiring knowledge. In other words, my connection with the visual arts and with words always remained with me, even as I tended more towards the latter, eventually, which probably led all the way to this kind of poetry. As I've said elsewhere, my favorite and first ekphrastic poem that I ever encountered is Musée de Boujar by W.H. Auden. The artwork that inspired Auden's poem is landscape with the fall of Icarus. You can probably look up that image. The artwork that inspired Auden's poem is by Peter Bruegel the Elder, one of the famous Flemish painters of the 13th century. The painting is housed in the Museum of Fine Arts in Belgium, which Auden visited in the 1930s. In the poem, Auden opens with a statement about suffering. They were never wrong, the old masters. I often use this as, I've seen this often used as an epigraph for many poems. As I am revisiting this introduction almost 3 years after I conceived it, it is now 2019, which is the peculiar time of post-truth, alternative facts, and fake news. Many authors advise us that rereading Auden is as important as going back to Orwell and their lessons and the tensions between power and truth. Auden goes on to describe the bucolic scene and details of the painting. The sun is seascape, the city and castle ruins hazy in the distance. Nearer to the viewer are the farmer plowing his field and the shepherd herding his flock, and almost unseen in the corner of the cliff and shore, a pair of legs flailing as its torso plunges into the dark water. The description ends with the almost casual remark that the ship passing below the cliffs had somewhere to get to and sailed calmly on. When Auden is able to do that in such a nonchalant manner, but leaves you with some tightness in the gut, he doesn't say, for example, that Icarus had failed in man's first attempt to fly. Echoing Bruegel's silence on the matter, it was then I first felt aware of the poet's power of contemplation, of him being able to articulate what the painting did not say or what the painting was in fact saying. It was then I discovered ekphrasis and probably the term itself as well. Ekphrastic poetry, by virtue of its name, is as old as Homer or art itself, which is its subject. Somewhere in the latter books of the Iliad, I think it's in book 30 or something, the epic poet describes the shield Hephaestus forged for Thetis in replacement of the one that her son Achilles had lost, the circumstances of such loss being a long story by itself. And this first ekphrastic poem is not even about a painting or a picture. It is the description of the Greek classical life, citizens going about their lives in the agora or square, the farmer farming, the young people dancing, soldiers making war, and other scenes, all of them in circular succession, and circumscribing them the rolling, scrolling waves of ocean. Yes, all in a circle, as if in a merry-go-round, because these scenes are carved on the face of the circular shield. But the shield is non-existent except in Homer's description, in a poem. Until in the 1800s, a London sculptor casts a bronze shield based on the blind poet's words, a reverse ekphrasis. This tells us about the reflective and reflexive character of ekphrasis, of looking at something or the world and looking back or on itself as it looks at the world, which is the general character of art itself. As I first encountered it, the ekphrastic poem does not always come with a work of art itself, as it does in this example I'm showing you later. It usually stands alone or separately without the reader having to look at or having the direct experience of the work of art. The poem was meant to be the experience of the art. That was the point. Many of the ekphrastic poems I encountered in college or later did not have the subject artwork shown with them in the anthologies I read. But gradually, as images of classical and modern paintings and other art became more accessible on the internet, ekphrastic poetry became some sort of fashion in online literary publication. In fact, I used to write an ekphrastic blog myself, which I later reformatted into a website on an online magazine by contributions of ekphrastic poetry accompanied by their subject pieces of art. As I believe the net itself was firstly a visual medium. After more than 2 years and several issues, I had to discontinue it because it was taking too much of my time. It needed some financial investment for rental of virtual space in order to continue to exist. It also needed the investment of the contributors themselves, though at some point it actually generated interest. I still get the occasional email of a poem and an artwork and some readers' good words. I will probably go back to the publication one of these days. Ekphrasis, as I said from the start, simply means explanation in Greek and may be generically applied to the art of elucidating a work of art. As it means as well, calling an inanimate object by name, we observe that it is like Adam naming things in paradise. Or in the Christian mode of acquiring knowledge and salvation, it is similar to the more formal biblical exegesis or hermeneutics for use in sermons by priests. The general ways a poet may write ekphrastically are 1, just describing with some explanation or comment, as Oden does, the subject art. 2, by giving voice to a piece of sculpture or character in a painting, as Browning does in My Last Duchess, which incidentally is also a dramatic monologue. By arguing or struggling with a work of art, or as in an agon or contest, which can come in the form of reinventing it altogether, as one describes or explicates it, as John Ashbery does in the book-length ekphrasis self-portrait in a convex mirror. There are other ways in between. The poetic experience created in the first ekphrastic experience of beholding the painting as a work of art gives the reader and the vicarious viewer 2 windows to the imagination of either the poet or the artist, or to imagination itself. But why poems about pictures? Well, why not? The biggest reason for me is that I can mine an artwork for deeper meanings which have already been extracted or framed by the artist from life itself. Though not verbally, it is a way not only of art appreciation, but a manner of making art speak. The way we make life or nature speak to us when we contemplate it. It is a manner of understanding life itself. And I find that in the process, in the act of becoming a poem, the other art takes on a new life. The pigments pulse, the images converse, the stone or bronze figures jump or cringe or bristle. It is a completely new story or artwork in itself, a second tranche aesthetic. In the Greek tradition that says art is an imitation of life or mimesis, or holds up a mirror to nature, ekphrasis holds up a mirror not just twice, which means as the poet compresses life into the frame of his poem based on the frame used by the artist, mirrors upon mirrors of reflection and the creation of meaning take place. Mirrors that, in my own manner of contemplation or conceit, I have the opportunity to break. So, is it necessary? Is art or poetry necessary? Is life, we might as well ask, what does it all mean? Why are we here? The uninterested or uninvolved will say, that's just a lot of air. Absolutely. If we give up on understanding life, well, all we get is thin air. Nothing on the other end. If we cannot resist trying to understand it, which is the stimulus or animation of the living soul, we go back to the immeasurable nothing we started with. The abyss we seek to avoid, the void we seek to understand, the air inside the frame. Let me give you an example of an ekphrastic poem which I did. Can you? Okay, let me read to you one poem. The Bridge at Mahayhay. And that is the painting, the basis of the poem. In the mind of Fra Victorino del Moral, it arches into space, inscribing the noble intentions of the Patronato Real. Upon these igneous blocks of volcano stone, we build the roots of the colonial church. Now it arches into a universe of mold, the aerial roots of balete and other leaves sprung from the seeds left by queasy birds among the joints and crevices where the mortar had chipped or come off. And 2 centuries of the jungle have grown thick in its disuse. Deemed ill-designed by his superiors, it became the Cura's Puente del Capricho, now concealed from memory's traffic, monument to men of little faith. In the memory of the Indio, it was tulay ng pigi, wax in the buttocks of the hapless conscript if he came late for work. The work of the Lord must not be delayed. Ruega por nosotros. Plodding through the brush and mud, the rubble and incline was the work of the devil. Every Indio who had to catch up with the gang cursed. Each face of adobe was our ass bared. El peo de nosotros. History's whim might have put together 2 ekphrastic minds to retell Mahayhay's bridge, a bridged tale of connection. The imagining of history itself and in its revision, as in re-eyeing the eye that looks at what has been, and re-speaking in the special language of tint or pigment, or the mesh of old canvas, the grain of old wood, the bracing air of Ayahay, mahayhay of old Laguna by the lake and its languid rivers, the reverie of heroes. Take, for example, the two processions about to intersect and commingle above the arch of the half-done bridge. The caprice of equinox or solstice brought together the radiant monstrance of the Corpus Christi and the hallowed sorrows of the Mater Dolorosa. What conspiracy of discalced Franciscans and wealthy Dominican schoolmasters brought them there? The one bearing the grieving mother on a palanquin of flowers, the other holding up poles of the sacramental canopy sheltering the Eucharist, and the black and white soutained reverendos clambering up a rickety, cumbersome ladder to join the skirmish. What harlequinous whimsy, better yet, what remained ribaldry from one osong sent them scrambling for their souls' safety. In my frame, it's what's to be seen under the arch of the partial bridge that reminds us of another of history's fancies. The man in the bowler hat, fresh from his execution at Bagumbayan, bullet wounds dripping red and luminous at his back, rides the baroto, standing upright, rowed towards the other shore by Elias, the boatman of Manunggul, as Maria Clara waits for them to hurry up. The fantasy asks or mocks, what bridge can stand the power of the Patronato Real or time's ravages? We see everything, both figures and processions in medias res, in art's subterfuge of suspended animation. The arch both dwarfs and canonizes the figures below. They have become altar pieces in the retablo and pantheon of our excavated memory, the reawakened anitus of our buried history. Is it only they who make the crossing? Well, the painting is actually one of those exhibited at the National Museum, and the whole exhibit is unique by the fact that those aren't really original paintings. They were conceived by the historian, sino nga yun? Sol Hofilenya, and executed as paintings by Guy Custodio. In the words of the curator, Ms. Gemma Cruz, a historian who does not paint and a painter weary of history. So the title of the show is a combination of the first syllables of their surnames. So the title is, the show is called Hocus. And this is one of the paintings that triggered me to write this poem. And that is one example of the type of poetry that I love to write from time to time. Sorry.
Thank you, Sir Marne. Good afternoon, everyone. Okay. Thanks to NBDB for the space and the time, and the staff has been great. Thank you for all your help in the past 2 days. I thought this afternoon I would talk about and read a few poems from my new book. The books are currently unavailable yet, and we're still working for distribution here, but I did bring a few copies, so in case you want to buy them, make sure you approach me after the talk. It's called The Experiment of the Tropics, and I thought I'd share some poems and thoughts this afternoon to help talk about the relationship of poetry and images. I hope they continue to be in conversation with the other panels we've had in the festival, especially regarding to the relationship to history, the production of texts in relation to image, and what it means to not only enact, but also to problematize the act of remembering. In the experiment of the Trombics, they began from photographs taken from the Cebuano Studies Center at the University of San Carlos. These photographs form part of the effort and the work of Dr. Resil Mojares, who put up the Cebuano Studies Center, and one part of that center are the photographs collected from different donors. It's an archive built mostly in the 70s. I think Dr. Mojares can talk more about this, but it always struck to me that part of the center's efforts were to begin to build regional centers of cultural studies, anthropology, literature, visual and performance culture. The photographs is a mix of photographs of the city, but also personal archives of many prominent families in Cebu. So it's a good mix of studio photographs, but also a good mix of photographs of the kind of changing landscape that Cebu had at the turn of the early 20th century. Many of the photographs were taken from the American period, and they reveal quite clearly a kind of burgeoning culture of photography. They are rife with the urge to document wealth and an ideal self, especially through studio photographs. They highlight the historical conditions in which we document life. And I thought I'd share a few of those photographs so you get a sense of the kind of photographs I was playing around with. When I was writing this book, I feel an important aspect of the process was that I printed out these photographs in 3R, 4R sizes. I'm quite old school when it comes to technology. So I really printed them out, and they were kind of this thick. And in my head, they're kind of like an old school kind of Instagram. And I remember that I carried these photographs with me in a lot of those trips when I was doing grad school, and then I'm based now in Singapore, so when I was finishing the book, I was carrying the photographs with me wherever I went. I don't know what the significance of that is, but I feel like that's an important part of the process of the writing of the book. And I think it's also indicative of a possible relationship between writing and looking and photographs. I think we're so used to now looking at photographs on the phone. I think it's one thing to do that with the thumb up, and it's another to kind of return to the old school photograph. So I guess these poems were written with, not with this, but with this. I would flip through them. Towards the end of the writing of the book, I would spend hours at this book was completed in Singapore's hawker centers. So if you've been in Singapore, you know how messy those hawker centers are. They're probably the only messy part of Singapore. The rest of Singapore is quite like clean and organized. But I found the need to run to those hawker centers, possibly because I was attracted to the mess. It was the only place where I felt my mind could write these poems. So if there are parts of these poems that are unabashedly sentimental, I would like to think it's because they are written from a kind of diasporic romanticism. And I'm sorry, not really sorry for that romanticism. I would like to think that sentimentality could be like the unnecessary ribbon on a head of hair that was neither an attempt to be beautiful or real, but was merely the necessary and remaining clip to hold one's hair up. One of the things I was interested, though, was the ways in which photography circulated in the early 20th century and the ways in which we could approach them as sites of historical inquiry but also creative inquiry. What could these photographs reveal? Where might we look and how? What would these photographs show about the time in which they were taken and the time in which we are thinking about them, which is sometimes simultaneous, sometimes belated from the moment we are looking at them? Because to look at a photograph is to always look at the past moment of looking through the eyes of an imagined moment of unseeing. Tomorrow, when I am no longer looking at the past, what will I be thinking of? What would these photographs reveal about our looking? How would a poet attempt to answer these questions as opposed to a historian? Which meant, on one hand, that I was still interested in fact. What is the name of that woman? Where is that tree in relation to that street that's already gone? Where is that mountain? What is the time? But I was also interested in the way these facts could be treated. The way one would, the name of an ingredient to a dish one was attempting to reconstruct from memory in order to feed one's guests for a night. Maybe I can read a few. In the time it takes for the shadow of the world to reach the shadow of the knee of the woman sitting in the park under a tree, a photograph is developed. Drip, drip, splash, then all right, then a dry mount against the wet, wet grass. When the city's architects asked what could be done with the past, they didn't anticipate glass. They believed the ocean, with its endless shimmer of always, would make the dame denizens of the city sick from squinting at the sea. What reprieve the streets could be. What rain falling endlessly from the eaves of shop houses as a line of trees becomes the token gesture nature makes to signify an elsewhere here where a woman slowly rises to become the shadow of a shadow of me. There is a river, and then there is a man. There is a skirt, and then there is a woman, 3 women, their feet dipped in the water. A dam is built in Bolok-Bolok and it is called Progress. A dam is built in Bolok-Bolok and families on weekends congregate in circles to watch the show of water spilling from the mouth of a river to the mouth of a wall. It is magic, says the girl standing at the edge of the pool, tilting her head to the right. It is magic, says the man holding his arms above the water, waving his arms above a stream that has been conjured first out of a bush, then out of a cliff, then out of a pipe that runs through miles across a city, miles across through towns where the corn is planted and the harvest reaped, where the fish is snared into a net and then hauled into a ship, where a church is built coral by coral until it is deemed a fitting place to worship. Ta-da! Magic happens by a trick of light and a gesture repeated, says the man who stands at the cusp of where a jet of water falls into a pool and creates out of his hands a spectacle out of an altogether natural thing. A woman holds a cup made of coconut husk into the air. A daughter smiles, her foot in the water on a stone, because she has been told all her life that she is beautiful and she believes it. Sorry, that was hard to read out loud. But they came from this, so some of the poems are directly responding to the photographs. Others are not. When I was thinking about the sequence of the book, some of the pictures are directly facing the poems they were written for. Others are misplaced. I was playing around with the idea that maybe as you read through the book, echoes of the photograph that you would have seen on page 5 would hopefully appear when you would read the poem again when it appeared on page 65. During the writing of these poems, an important notion was Barth's idea of the punctum. So for the lit majors there, I think you all know that, the punctum and the studium. Barth prized an emotional physicality to the act of looking. What the eye saw, which hit the mark of the heart beyond thinking in spite of thinking. That which stayed on the fringes of seeing, in addition to and in spite of, and sometimes the very subject of the photograph. Not the name of that face, but its shape. Not the shirt, but the fold of the fold that folded over the sleeve. For Barth, there was the studium, and for him, the studium of a photograph was the subject of the photograph. So, for example, one might say the studium of this is the river. But for him, there was something called the punctum, and it's very close to the word puncture. It is the part of the photograph that kind of punctures you. It is the thing which hits you. And it might not be like the main reason for it. It might be a very little thing. But that's the part that stayed. And I used that as a way of writing these poems, I think. At the start, I was like, oh, I need to do research. Like, what's the name of the woman? Or like, what part of Cebu was this? But I'm a very bad historian, and I'm not good with research. So I was just like, okay, Larry, just stop making a fool of yourself and just like, yeah, stop doing that. And what in response to that, I felt like, let me just look at these photographs and let me see and hear what they might want to show or see. It's in many ways trusting, I think, the act of looking, and trusting that there is something in this photograph. And you might forget the other details of this tonight, but there is probably something, at least one thing here, which hopefully punctures you. And that's the punctum. Not the shirt, but the fold of the fold that folded over the sleeve. There is a brooch that held a shawl over a shoulder. No matter the era of that fashion of looking the camera in the eye, that the tip of the needle that sealed lock not pricked the finger that held the clasp, Barth's punctum suggested to me a kind of peripheral vision, a kind of accidental documentation, that in the face of the studium, the reason for a photograph, a building, a woman, a man, something else was caught as a matter of recourse of the moment of the taking of the photograph. Something was dragged into the picture, a tree, a shadow, and in that way, we have history. I'm interested in the history that accidentally gets caught in the photograph. Perhaps there is something to be said about what Dr. Mojares yesterday described in his talk. I don't know if Sir remembers this, but there was a phrase that Sir Russell used, and he called it like sentimental documentation. I'm not quite sure if that was said as a compliment or an insult. But when he said that, I was just like, oh, maybe perhaps what I was doing was a kind of sentimental documentation, which suggests a possibility of a history driven by the rhythms of feeling that takes into account vagary, impulse, urge, an intersection really between looking and feeling, a site of both history and memory. Because I think they're two different things. History is not memory, but sometimes they intersect. And I was interested to the extent that form, in the way that it can be understood as a way of seeing, that maybe there was something that poetry could offer as a way of writing about the way we look at the past. Maybe poetry could suggest not historical accuracy, but an imaginative relationship to history. This is what was, this is what is. but in rendering a continuing dialogue of an imaginative looking, we honor and reckon with the past. Sorry, two more things that might be relevant to this project. One of which has to do with what we've been speaking in many of the panel discussions in this PILF, and that's the question of national memory. I feel like an important aspect of this project for me was that I was working with photographs from Cebu. I still don't know yet the repercussions of that, but I think it was vital for me to consider that what I was dealing with were visual artifacts that originated from outside the center of the Philippines and outside of a space that would automatically be considered national. What it means to look at that, to look at the edge, to look at the fringe instead of the center. And maybe the second thing, and maybe we can continue to talk about it later in the panel, is made me think that while it is tempting to understand memory as a passive reception of images and feelings from the past, I think we mostly run with an idea of memory as just like you kind of sit back and the images flood you, which is a kind of surrender, and that always makes remembering interesting. But I'm wondering if that can also be dangerous because it suggests being passive, and the past is just something which comes, where in fact by writing about these photographs and writing about history, we're encouraged to look actively, to just remember that memory and remembering is active. And we must bring to it all the faculties that we have of sensing and looking and imagining. So just a few more minutes, I thought I would maybe end with a few more poems to give you a wider sense of the kind of poems that are here. There have been already a number of reviews of the book, and I'm surprised or not surprised that a lot of them call them erotic poems. I mean, I always take that as a compliment. I was just like, I'm just writing about history. Like, why do you think they're erotic poems? But sometimes the reader is smarter than the writer, so maybe they really are erotic poems. I broke my heart, said the man in rattan. I broke my heart, said the man in rattan, as he sang a song in clippings. How special it was, that feeling to be broken. A clutter of things that could become the pretext for a painting of place. If only it held him, twig to needle to groove, a public loneliness made mainstay to the day itself, so the inside becomes the outside, to be seen by the shape of a shell battered and bent on a wall to become decoration. How fortunate to be gathered, he thought, as if by accident. There was a chair to sit on. There was a shirt. There are 14 ways to say I might, 50 ways to turn the tide, 2 kitchens, 1 dry. There is a picture of a room within a brightly lit afternoon where my aunt sat staring at the bougainvillea until the day it died. She fell to the ground 3 times but then stood up, while the men in the kitchen sat after the meal had been set, eyeing the silver she had gathered, the lacquer, 13, 14. She began each morning with hot water. She lived on a diet of fish. There was a chair, but she didn't sit on that. She was my aunt. And maybe one more. I could say, as when a boy folds the sleeves of his shirt up to that spot on his elbow where there is enough of his arm to say, well. Or when a man lifts his daughter and shakes her while in his mind he holds another. By the tightness of a tie, the looseness of a stance, a man is measured. If you cannot walk straight, dear sir, at least sit straight. There was a smile to be made with one's mouth closed and the full force of joy that depended for its documentation on that double tandem armament of cheek and eye. A chandelier shook, but whether this was any indicator that the house was all right and there was no need to regard the neighbor from afar as much as the son's guess as anyone's, the sheen of the picture was always in the holder, dear history of mine. Thank you. So I think we're meant to have a few minutes of conversation between me and Marne, but because there's just two of us, so we might as well open it to everyone, you know. Magchichikalahan lang pala kami. But then, yeah, I think it might be more appropriate since there's just two of us. If we open it, you know, so feel free to interrupt whenever. How should we start this? Sige.
Are there any questions po from the audience? Yes, sir.
Good afternoon po. I'm Lawrence, and I have first of all a commentary. I was just struck by the way you approach history in different ways. The contrast in scope between Sir Marne, you had this rhetoric of analyzing. You were asking questions in the poem that you showed, and Larry, you had lyrical speculations. And yeah, so the contrast in the way you approach history as an object. And my question is, what do you think about the way that images or the way that we look at images has changed because of history? Ayun.
Sorry, just to clarify the question, in what way do you think the way we look at these images have changed because of history? Yeah. Yeah. No, I feel like what's been at least more relevant to me is technology. I think it's really shaped the ways in which we approach the visual image. I think a well-known essay would be Walter Benjamin's Age of Mechanical Reproduction. That notion that images can be replicated and then that they can spread out very far from their original purpose. So we live, and we take that for granted. I think we live in a time where we don't think of images as something that is singular and can only exist somewhere in Cebu, for example. We live in a time where technology allows us to bring those images with us. So on one hand, there's a little less preciousness with the image. I don't think we treat them the way we would like a piece of art, which we feel like exists only singularly. But on the other hand, I think it's extremely hard to think of a way of thinking that is not shaped by the visual. I think the visual has completely, it has gone so far compared to the other senses. It makes me think of like looking as merely one of 5 senses, and I think it has completely dominated the way in which we imagine thinking should be. To think is to look already now. To think is to see. It makes me wonder, like maybe in an alternative universe, if to think was to smell, or for to think was to hear, I don't know, we would think differently. I don't know. That's what, yeah, at least for me.
Well, in my own case, looking specifically at the picture itself is itself speculative, no? The picture has been composed by 2 minds collaborating, one a historian and one a painter. And what they did through, I think they did it through email before they even talked about it face to face, was what if you composed an image based on what I know about history as represented by that unfinished bridge in Mahayhay. So that's how the whole exhibit created itself, in a manner of speaking. So that within those limits, that's the only way the poetry can create itself, I think. So even the poem itself is in that speculative mode, and yet it is also a manner of commenting on the whole colonial experience, as it ends probably symbolically with a man in the bowler hat with his wounds fresh on his back. And what sort of experience was it for the race, for our race? Do certain things converge at that crossing of the river under an unfinished bridge? If you ask the people in Mahayhay, it's almost a mystery to them why the bridge was unfinished. Well, according to the historical notes, the bridge was unfinished because the authorities stopped the priest who undertook to construct the bridge, because they thought it was structurally unhealthy. So it was left unfinished. And that, I think, also says a lot about some of our colonial experience. That's why the poem itself is phrased in interrogatives, no? I think the structure of the poem is that it looks as the picture in 3 frames, no? The intentions of the Patronato Real, meaning the Spanish authority, the Spanish church authorities, and by implication the Spanish government itself. The point of view of the Indio who was, conscripted to work on the bridge, and our own way of looking at it. In this case, my own frame, as I said, in my frame. So I thought I made that vivid enough in the poem. That's why it ends with a man who is crossing the bridge, and the questions if who makes the crossing, who are able to make the crossing. I hope that answers your question.
Questions from the audience? Yes, sir.
Good afternoon. I'd just like to ask, because there's still a mention of the archive and the nation in your talks, how do you see the role of poetry today in a national project? And is that still something that you're thinking about? As a nation and project colonialism archive.
Yeah. I've been thinking about what it means to think about the fake. You know, when you're approaching history through the lens of creative writing or poetry, I think your loyalty is not always to fact. It is to truth, you know. But then those are also the same impulses that could easily lead to historical revisionism. You know, so I've been thinking about that very, you know, what it means to approach history with the intent to revise it and to hide, with the intent to imagine. Is there a positive way of revising? I don't know the answers to that, but I think in the midst of a time where historical revisionism is being done, it makes me wonder whether poetry allows for a certain kind of revisionism that is positive rather than negative. And I wonder whether the work of the poet is not to tell the truth too, but to lie in a different way, to show a lie. I don't know if am I making sense, Nico? Yeah. It makes me wonder about lying and the kind of different ways one lie, because one is obviously meant to repress, another is meant to liberate. But then how do we sometimes know the difference? Yeah.
I don't know if I'm also able to answer the question, but it's not to revise history, it's to reimagine it as you find it in these images, di ba? I have a favorite poem of mine, which was inspired. This is the first time I'll be telling it to Resil, which was inspired directly by the brains of the nation after I read the book, and I was so touched by the chapter on Isabelo de los Reyes that I used the facts there to try to recreate the last few years of Don Belong's life. And it was also based on my own experience of going to the jail when I visited Barcelona once, where they, incarcerate criminals, exiles from the colonies. Both Isabelo de los Reyes and Jose Rizal, I think, made their significant stops at the Montjuic jail in Barcelona. I'm not sure if anyway, but I'm not sure if it's in my next book or one of my more recent books, and that's and again the title says, I won't read the poem now, but the title says the very tentative way a poet approaches history, because of I think that art doesn't work on very accurate parameters, for that matter. For example, the poem that was inspired by the chapter on Don Belong is titled this way: Don Belong at Montwick and My Artificial Memory. So for me, even my own memory was artificial. It was recreated by my way of by my reading of the chapter in Brains of the Nation, and then by the memory I tried to retrieve because I visited Barcelona a long time before I read the book. So it is magulo, and yet I think the resulting poem, which I'm quite happy about, is a real recreation of that period in Isabelo de los Reyes' life, in which which allowed me to comment on the circumstances surrounding his exile and much of what he represented in our history, in our national life, for that matter.
More questions? Yes.
I'd like to ask Larry specifically. We have been interacting with American writers. I would like to ask, what's it like to write some of these poems in Singapore and interacting with Singaporeans or Southeast Asians writing in English? Were you able to observe something and learn something that you were not able to see or observe interacting with Filipinos writing in English?
Ang hirap naman dyan. I think my being in Singapore for the past 3 years has made me a bit more conscious about what it means to be Southeast Asian in a way that I would not ever think if I would have written these poems here. I think the category of Southeast Asian presents, I don't know, it seems on one hand very dated. Like I don't hear Filipinos saying they're Southeast Asian. No? In a way that Singaporeans and Malaysians and Thai do. And for me, it's a very important category because it reminds me about a shared history in our region. And although we look sometimes elsewhere for affinity and help, and yeah, there is so much to offer by looking at the countries we are literally surrounded by, because they too have gone through a history of colonialism and have responded to it on their own way. And I don't think we really have given them the chance to teach us what it means to deal with history, because they have dealt with it in different ways than we have. And there probably isn't one way better or not. It's not about who deals with history better. It's, I think, learning about the different ways we write about history. That has been very valuable for me in talking with Singaporean writers or writing these poems in Singapore. Kasi parang na-aware ako na, di ba, parang, am I writing this as a Southeast Asian poet versus a Filipino poet? And is there a difference? Sa tingin ko meron eh. Nagbukas siya ng ibang perspective, ibang angle. Yeah.
More questions po from the audience.
Talking about technology, I'm just wondering, so like, Larry perhaps can respond to, like, I was wondering, like,
the visual image here takes the form of old photographs, at a time when photographs were not popularly accessible. And so even just looking at the photograph, I mean, there's a certain weight to it, because you know that kind of photographs then were not as rampant as they are today. And given also that the fact that these are old photographs, these are kind of, in a sense, a limited number of those that survived time and have come to the present. So kind of, by their very nature, kind of they invite a particular kind of attention, and probably like kind of a different style of kind of reflecting on the images. So how different would poetry be, or would the poems be in the age of the selfie, for instance, when kind of visual images are so kind of rampant, profuse, and kind of in terms of how they affect our way of looking at things, and the kind of the meaning that we invest these images with, kind of. I mean, it's interesting, kind of, like it's remarkable. Like, for instance, when did we get to see, for instance, an image of an individual Filipino? I mean, like even like paintings, for instance. When do you have like, even before photography, the first known painting of an individual Filipino? I mean, like a real person, not a. I mean, I think you've heard of Tipos del País. These were like kind of very popular. But these were like painted images of types, social types, like a milk seller, kind of a merchant, and so on. These are social types. These are not supposed to be images of persons, that individuals that actually existed. So the first image of a real individual native came only around 1850, kind of the painting of actually the grandfather or great-grandfather of Pedro Paterno, a merchant. So a real person. This was the first time that we have the image of a real native. Earlier, of course, there were like paintings of Spaniards and so on, but natives were largely invisible as individuals. And then when photography came in, and of course photography was not kind of popularly accessible. It kind of, cameras, who would have cameras then, and kind of, and so they had a particular significance. In fact, in the story of the revolution, it's remarkable, like Rizal, De Los Reyes, and so on, they were so keen about circulating photographs of Filipino leaders. Now, it's as though like there was a need to make us visible to the world, that we are real and we exist. And so they kind of, and photographs then had a certain, had distinct materiality, in the sense that kind of there were heirlooms, there were gifts, they were to be circulated. And of course, digital images today do not have that kind of weight, right? So, so what, like, I wonder, like Larry, for instance, like how would that change the poems that you write if you are thinking of digital images instead of old photographs from the early 20th century?
Yeah, I've never written a poem on a selfie. Let me just come out with that. No? I think that part of the preciousness of old photographs, for me, has always encouraged a kind of artificiality of language too. So in certain ways, I wonder if it is the oldness of the photographs that makes me want to write poetry about it. And it brings out a very weird relationship to language too, I think, where I'm not too concerned with being clear. And I allow myself to be flowery and weird and wrong. Whereas I think a more contemporary photograph, like a selfie or something I would have taken yesterday, might not elicit a poem from me, but might elicit something else. So I can imagine writing a nonfiction piece or an essay on a photograph I took yesterday, whereas like a photograph like these from a century ago would bring out poems. So it makes me think about the relationship of looking and speaking and writing and the kind of sensitivities that they bring out.
And I think the main difference between archival photographs and the modern selfie, for example, is the archival photographs are still precious up to now, while the selfie or even our group photos taken in this are almost disposable. They proliferate. But photographs such as this, you have to go to the archives to be able to see them, even if they're available on the internet, which is quite recent, no? These photographs, or the ones before this, were even in that period were rare commodities. Right now, our photographs are, again, they're almost disposable. We have, in our computers and telephones, we have hundreds of them collected from our daily interactions. No? So, I think that's the main difference. That's why we choose our subject matters, the visual subject matters, quite carefully. As much as possible, ako gusto ko kwan lang, art lang, hindi. Well, I have poems about photographs. I have one poem about a very contemporary photograph, but it was compelled by the seriousness of the photograph. I'm referring to the drowned boy, the refugee boy that drowned and his picture was taken at the beach, and he's quite dead, and that compelled me to write about it. So we really choose. We are forced to choose our matter when it comes to this picture poems, I call them.
Yeah. 5 minutes na lang daw. Baka may mga last question or... Yeah.
Visually impaired. I could answer that quite quickly, I think, because, as I said, yung mga dating ekphrastic poems that I encountered really never were accompanied by the subject images. In fact, the poem was originally intended to recount the visual experience. So it actually existed almost independent of the picture. So you can visualize. If it is read to the visually impaired, he no longer needs the picture.
Sa akin mahalaga yung music. mahalaga sa akin na tula siya. Part of my hope in these poems is that they capture maybe like yung rhythm ng pagtingin at hindi ko alam kung baka may chance na ma-translate yung rhythm na yon sa tula. So baka mararamdaman ng hindi nakakakita ng photograph yung proseso ng pagtingin ko sa photograph. At sana matransmit yung experience na yon through sound. Mahalaga sa akin yung narinig nyo naman, medyo OA ako magbasa ng tula. Kasi mahalaga sa akin yung music. It's able to transmit an experience also. Yeah.
I'll just add, no? Mahalaga rin sa akin, tulad ng kay Larry. Of course, yung music, yung sound ng words, mahalaga lagi yan sa tula. But yung tula about a visual subject matter should itself possess much narrative element and visualization so that the reader and the listener doesn't have to look at the actual picture. For example, the main example is I read W.H. Auden's Le Musée du Beaux-Arts long before I saw the actual painting by Bruegel. So, yung kwano ni parang rediscovery na lang yung nung makita. Ito pala yun. But the poem was sufficient unto itself, I think.
I think we are done. Maraming salamat. If you want copies to buy, let's approach me.
Thank you to our speakers, Sir Larry and Sir Marne. Our next session is Production Hack.